Serious, deep woods hikers and campers, what is the strangest or scariest situation you have come across? Of the countless hours I've spent in the woods, it's the one time, the only few seconds, that I can't explain. I distance hike when I can. Sometimes this means getting up early, or staying out late, to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes, walking in the pitch dark with a low light headlamp gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under our canopy of stars more nights than I can count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trail, riverbank, lakeshore, ridge, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've hunted the game. I'm establishing this because it's important you understand I've heard, seen, and smelt about all this region has to offer in the way of the wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened at about 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another 30 to 45 minutes, another hour past that until sunrise. I was on mile 5. I'm in a low bottom that's wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I was on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush, young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, zoned out. Then I heard a loud crack. And I froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. 0430 in springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze. When fight or flight kicks in, you have these immediate instinct thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself into silence was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around, and I'm going back the way I came in a hurry. Why? Because that sound was not a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I had just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, well, that meant get out of here. To describe it as best I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree. More a fungo bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head was that this sound was a crack, and not a thud or thump. And I have described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden and terribly loud. I had the sense that it was about 50 yards directly in front of me, and it was loud and clear. Now, as I stood there, completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from. And I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge going away from the creek. This meant, as soon as I got the courage to move towards this noise, I was going to have to turn my back to it and get up that ridge. This made me very nervous. My head was somewhere between meth fiend murder and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes pass. I just breathe my foggy breath into my glasses and listen. Nothing. Dead quiet. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes until first light. I crank up the headlamp and start to slowly creep to the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail. It didn't help. I get to the turn, and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point. Trying to be quiet. Taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. And then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined wet, rotten, death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter. This was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast. By the time I made the top of that ridge, I was huffing, and the first light was showing. I didn't stop moving until full light was out, and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, and especially leafed-out branches, make a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times. I don't know. Walking out to a deer blind pre-dawn in the Texas Hill Country, hunted the same area for 25 years, got the big spook, to the point I drew my pistol and turned on the weapon light, scanning the area around me, walking backwards at times, etc. Crawled up in my tree blind and got settled in. But I just could not shake the spook. Sun finally rose, and my tension started to ease off. Saw something big and low moving in the brush about 70 yards out but couldn't see it clearly because there were still deep shadows. A little while later, I see something weird walking across the center about 150 yards out. I scoped it, and the only mountain lion I have ever seen in the wild was very casually crossing the center, stopped for a few seconds, and I swear it looked right at me, then moved along. I stayed up that tree a long time, and I finally came down late in the afternoon while the sun was high, and I had been seeing game move around me for a while. 10 years ago, when I was a skinny little 17-year-old, I was hiking the rural side of a levee with a friend who was even scrawnier than I was. It was a long, long walk into the woods, and for about an hour or more, we hadn't seen anyone else. Just trees and foliage. We finally stumbled upon a huge nest-looking area. It was so random, and out of place, so we investigated. There was paper and cloth everywhere, torn magazine pages, old clothes, cans, everything piled into one huge mess. We assumed maybe people drove their truck out here and dumped their trash, so we just turned to leave, but in that very moment, we saw a tall, rugged man wearing all black staring right at us. He was maybe 6'3", had shaggy, unkempt hair, and looked dirty and disturbed. He stood 15 feet away, and he was just staring and silent. My friend didn't say anything, so I said, "Hi. Do you live here? Is this your stuff?" And he only nodded yes, and then we slowly backed away and left. He just stared at us until we could no longer see him anymore, and then we picked up speed to get back to civilization. TLDR, I went hiking with a group of 20 people, fell behind due to slow pace, thought I was talking to my friend that was next to me, but it turns out he was with the rest of the group and not with me. Me and a group of 20 others were hiking in a two-person side-to-side line through thick woods at around 1 a.m. We managed to find a muddy road which we continued to walk over for miles before going back into the woods. While walking on the muddy road, I held a conversation with one of my friends that was to the right of me. After a while of talking, I noticed that my group was further ahead of me than before, so I picked up the pace. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. The friend I was talking to was already with the rest of my group. I asked him how he got back so quickly, and he turned, looked at me and said, "I was wondering where you were. You disappeared for a good 5 minutes." Let's just say I didn't feel alright after hearing those words. I know for a fact I was speaking to him earlier, and if not him, then someone exactly the same with all the same gear. Luckily, nothing happened after that, but I was pretty shook for the rest of the hiking night. This all happened in Poland when I was a teenager, part of what I call a survivalist camp. I was camping alone on a beach a few years ago. At just after 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, like something was gently brushing up against the tent. The waves were pretty loud, so I wasn't sure. As I started to fall back asleep, I heard it again. This time, I sat up. Suddenly, the sides of my tent were getting pushed in. I could see the shapes of hands pushing it in on all sides. No sounds came from outside other than the ocean. I was too terrified to even say a word. I've never been that scared in my life. After a few seconds that felt like an hour, it suddenly stopped. I waited for a few minutes, then unzipped the tent and poked my head out and flicked on a flashlight. There were shoe prints all around the tent. I figure it was probably just some kids messing with me. But damn, did they ever mess with me. I was camping up in Haber, Arizona, with my brothers and my dad. I was 15 or so at the time, and we were deep in the woods, far from most other camps. Me and my brothers had our own tent while my dad had a separate one not far off. He likes to give us our privacy while we were camping. We would usually run around a bit at night before going to bed, entering our camp to sleep at about 11 p.m. One night we were playing hide and seek when we heard a branch snap a few yards from us. We assumed it was an elk or something since they were pretty common in our area. We would typically go to our tent if we saw one in hopes of not agitating it. So that's what we did. I called for my youngest brother, who was still hiding, and he revealed himself to be hiding behind a branch pile not super far from where the noise originated. We went to the tent, and I decided that we should just go to sleep since it was already pretty late. The next morning, I went to check the spot for elk prints since I found them pretty fascinating. Instead, I found large cat prints. I knew they were cat prints because they had the 4-toe pads and the large center pad as well as no claw marks. I was honestly kind of excited. I had always wanted to see a mountain lion or a bobcat in the wild, but it never happened. Knowing that I was that close to either one was very thrilling. It then occurred to me that my youngest brother was hiding, separated from us scarily close to the paw prints location. It occurred to me that if that was a hungry mountain lion and it had taken notice of my 6-year-old brother hiding alone, it could have possibly taken the chance. We stopped doing hide and seek at night to avoid those types of situations, and we actually set up a roll call system to ensure everyone was together at night. Now, I know a mountain lion likely wouldn't have done anything had it seen him, but still, the risk felt very real, and I worried that had I not heard it, I could have lost my brother. I was camping in Northern California, like at the very tippy top of California, deep in the woods at a reservoir. I had to go poop really bad early in the morning before the sun was up and there were no bathrooms. So, I walked down a trail and found a little spot isolated away from the trail next to a blackberry bush and an outcropping of water from the reservoir. I heard some crashing in the tree line, and it just started to become slightly light outside. I peeked over the blackberry bush, and not 40 feet from me was a huge bear, around 500 pounds. I tried to sneak away, but as I was stepping backwards, I kid you not, I stepped on a twig that snapped. This bear and I instantly turn our heads toward one another and lock eyes. I attempted to make myself look big and make noise. Bear didn't budge. In fact, he started to walk towards me. So many things were racing through my mind, the number one being, there is no way I'm curling up into a ball and allowing this monstrously giant bear to play with me, so I crouched down as low as I could behind the blackberry bush so he couldn't see me, and started running as fast as I could while squatting down. My thought process was that if he couldn't see me run, maybe he wouldn't chase if I was already kind of far away before he actually saw me running over the blackberry bush. It worked. He pursued around the bush for maybe 20 feet, decided it wasn't worth it, and allowed my escape. I honestly thought I was going to be breakfast for this bear, and that would be the end of me. A few years ago, I was camping in the Serengeti as a part of a safari I was doing. We had set up our tents in a designated camping area with a bathroom building. I'm from the States and have been camping and backpacking tons of times, but the Serengeti felt different. We could hear baboons from our tents for one. In the middle of the night, I had to pee, so I carefully unzipped my tent and started walking through the grass toward the bathrooms. Already I was feeling a little jumpy. When I creaked open the bathroom door, a ton of bats flew over my head out of the building. It felt like that scene in Batman Begins where young Bruce Wayne fell in the cave, haha. I was just really hoping that nothing else was in the bathroom, and it just felt really eerie. It ended up all right, but I was really glad to get back to my tent. On a separate trip, I was hiking through southern Ethiopia with a guide to a lake where we would be able to take a boat to see some hippos. It was quiet for the most part, but a portion of our hike took us through some brush and trees, and we started hearing this loud, gruesome moaning, and the whole forest felt still. We looked and looked to figure out what was making the sound, and we saw a massive baboon laying face down on the ground, dying. We gathered from its position that it must have fallen from a tree and seriously injured itself and was crying out in pain. Obviously, we kept our distance because we didn't know how it would react, or if any other animals would be nearby. The noise it made was both heartbreaking and terrifying, and it had an almost spiritual quality to it. We moved on shortly after, but I'll forever remember how I felt watching this animal die alone in the forest. Honestly, one of the most surreal experiences of my life. So not necessarily a deep woods camper, but when my wife and I first met, we did a lot of off-the-trail camping to get away from people. We would always go to the same spot. Nothing strange ever happened until one time we woke up to the most beautiful native flute music. It was so peaceful that I wasn't as afraid as I felt I should have been. We eventually got up and started moving around, and the music stopped. We never heard it again and always joked that it was Bigfoot serenading his mate. TLDR, I saw a couple of UFOs and got scared because of a cow. In late summer, my boys and I were dry camping on a plateau above one of the many canyons in the Snake River wilderness. The first night, at about 1 a.m. we saw several lights rise into the sky, what seemed to be about 10 miles away. We immediately thought it was just drones and thought nothing of it. Then we started seeing flashing amber lights reflecting off of the canyon walls. So, naturally, my curiosity compelled me to see what was going on. We got in the truck and started driving down the only road in the area, hoping that we could get close enough to see. After about 30 minutes, everything went dark, and we never saw any more lights. We never did find out what it was. On the second night, we had just gotten to sleep, when I was woken up by wolves howling. At that point, I wasn't scared at all and was kind of fascinated by the sounds. They seemed pretty far off, and it was cool to listen to. I drifted back to sleep, then sometime later was woken up by the sounds of running animals. I bolted upright just in time to see several animals that looked to be wolves, hard to tell by moonlight through a tent screen, running right past our truck. They never stopped. Just a dead run past us. It is the only time I have ever seen wolves in the wild, and it was intimidating to see just how big they really are. But even with all of that excitement, that wasn't the scariest part of the night. About 2 hours after the wolf event, I had to get up to piss. I didn't even want to get out of the tent, but the bladder kind of forced the issue. I worked up the courage to get up, slung my gun around my shoulder, and stepped outside. I was about midstream when a thud and the sound of footfalls came from the area just to my right. I spun and drew my other gun in a full panic, only to realize it was a cow rubbing against a small pine tree about 40 yards away. I have never been so relieved to see a cow in my life. I hiked up to a Buddhist monastery once. The hike took a few days and, on the way back we had to meet up with our lift at a power plant. We were hiking for hours to finally get there, and it was raining too, so we were all a bit miserable by this stage. Just before we finally got to the power plant, we reached a small open clearing that was inhabited by around a dozen small wild ponies. They were so friendly, and I fed them some of my raisins, and they let us pet them. It was so magical. A couple of times in Australia had creepy or scary experiences. One time early morning, I was awoken to the sound of a really drunk guy with a thick accent yelling outside our tent for us to go back to England. I wondered how he knew we were from England. Had he been watching us? Listening to us talk? Then he started yelling for people to go back to Russia, and Great Britain, and so on, and we realized he wasn't yelling at us. He was just yelling. I think he was an Aborigine based on his accent, and so yeah, dude totally gets why you're pissed, haha. One of our first nights, we arrive in this empty site with thick undergrowth well off the beaten track. The area had been absolutely ravaged by bushfires a few years prior but had mostly recovered. A car pulls up late at night and people get out with flashlights. My wife and I are on edge, barely breathing. I am doing my best to convince her it's probably just late arrivals to calm her down, but I, too, am really nervous. Eventually, the flashlights went away, and they settled down for the night. I realized in the morning they had done exactly what we'd done except late at night, walked around the empty campsite to find a good spot before pitching up. Learned to relax a bit more after that. One night, a bunch of lads, must have been mostly 15 to 16 with maybe a couple older brothers and a dad, turned up. The site was about a third full with mostly older people and campers, but we were in a tent. The dozen or so tent pitches were in a semicircle with a basic tin-roofed communal kitchen area in the middle, and these lads took over there, and were drinking late into the night. The sound was like an amphitheater, so it kept us awake. At around 1 a.m., I went over and said something like, "Hey guys, it's getting pretty late now, would you do me a massive favor and just keep the noise down a bit?" Cheers, and they were respectful and said like, "Yeah mate, no worries." And predictably made no effort whatsoever to keep quiet. About 20 minutes after I'd gotten back into bed, I distinctly heard one of the louder boys say, "I'm going to bottle that cunt and rape his wife." At this point, it's important to say I'm not a confrontational guy, nor do I ever get in fights. I was really scared but also really angry, and my wife was terrified. After about maybe another 2 hours of noise, I grabbed my hatchet, got dressed, and as I walked out, I put the hatchet down on the hood of the truck and walked over to their campsite, where they'd moved to, and just started yelling. I think I said something like, "It's 3 in the morning, you're loud, and you're taking the piss. Shut the F up and go to sleep." And to the dude who said he'd bottle me, "I'm right here. I'm right here." I'm surprised the dad and the older brothers didn't say anything, but the kid just said sorry, and that was that. It was pretty awkward in the morning when I had to walk past them, but I just said good morning and how you doing and all that, and it was fine. Admittedly felt like Billy Badass for a while, but my wife was angry at me and said it was really stupid to go out and confront a large group of men like that. She was right. By far the scariest thing, when camping with other people. I was out camping on a river with some friends. Mid-afternoon we took off hiking down a trail that led back to the same river just a bit further up. Our plan was to just float back down. We're just rolling along talking about everything and nothing. Just enjoying the day. Then all of a sudden, my friend does the universal arms in front of our chest to stop silently, so we do. To our utter dismay, he points out something my young mind wasn't ready for. There's a middle-aged guy camping down the embankment on the river just beating off in a camping chair. What? We were making enough noise for him to have known we were there. Creep. Had to turn around and walk back. It was funny at the time, but that is some depraved weird shit. I was out with a friend a few miles from Pikes Peak in Colorado. We were hiking on this trail, and up ahead, I saw a blue windbreaker in the middle of the trail. We hadn't seen anybody else out walking all day. It's pretty remote where we were staying, so it was weird it was placed right in the middle of the path. But hey, things happen, and people drop things, so maybe it fell out of a backpack, and nobody noticed. The windbreaker was just a piece of this entire campsite we ended up coming across that was absolutely torn to shreds. There was a tent, a hammock, a cooler, and a backpack. Various articles of clothing were thrown about as well. The tent had broken poles, was shredded, and looked like it was from the early 2000s with the fading that was apparent and the old style of it. Think of a basic 4-person Walmart tent, not a nice fancy lightweight backpacking tent. The hammock was still hanging. Empty. The cooler was open and empty. A few shirts and shorts were scattered, and the backpack was empty. We told ourselves it must be some homeless shelter, and that was a good enough excuse for us to leave everything how it was and continue back to the cabin we were staying in.